People who earn their living in a modern heavy industry seldom engage in the kind of back-breaking toil that was the everyday lot of most workers a century ago. And yet, they earn far more. What has produced these improvements? The offhand reaction of most people is likely to be that labor unions are largely responsible for the enormous progress that workers have made in the past 2 centuries. But clearly, at least for the United States, that cannot be true. After all, in the 19th century, when workers did very well, there were hardly any labor unions at all. And even today, no more than 1 out of 4 or 5 workers is a member of a trade union, and the remainder do very well indeed, achieving the highest level of living in the world. Labor unions do, of course, benefit their members, but far from being a key to the development of the modern society, they are a throwback to an earlier pre-industrial era, to the agreements among craftsmen in the Middle Ages, or to go back even earlier, more than 2,000 years ago, to the agreement among medical men in Greece. These workers are on the other side of the union fence. They're building 2 Social Security offices in Baltimore. On this government project, everyone's a union worker. They rely on their union to protect them against competition from non-union labor. But some local contractors see a very different side to a closed shop.
We don't feel that anybody should be denied a choice, and we feel every man should have the choice if he wants to be unionized or not. Not legislative, not saying he must belong to a union. We feel when you tell a man he must belong to a union or he must do this or that, you're taking freedoms away from this man, the freedom of choice of this businessman here to choose me, to do business with me. All business needs this right to choose to do business with each other. And by the same token, our employees have the right to choose whether they want unionization or not.
Unions have long recognized that the surest and most effective way for them to get power without violence is to have the federal government on their side. That's why so many strong unions have made it a point to locate their headquarters close to the source of power. The heads of the trade unions that cluster near Capitol Hill know this place very well. It is the room assigned to the Committee on Education and Labor of the House of Representatives, and it is where much of our labor legislation is discussed and shaped before presentation to Congress. I know rooms like this myself very well because I've often testified before congressional committees, and they all meet in rooms like this. Up there on the podium is where the members of the House or of the Senate sit. Of course, behind them, there will be clustered a bunch of aides. As you know, there are something like 30 to 40 aides for every single member of the House and the Senate. And very often in one of these committee rooms, there'll be almost nothing but aides around. When I've sat in the bear pit over here, where the witnesses sit to testify, I've sometimes thought that maybe the whole thing was a show being conducted by and for the aides, with an occasional member of the House or senator dropping by to see what the show was all about. This is a room in which hearings were held on the most recent increase in the minimum wage, for example. Who do you suppose testified here in favor of a higher minimum wage rate? Do you suppose it was representatives of the poor people who were supposedly being helped by the bill? Not a bit of it. The major people testifying for it were representatives of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL-CIO, the major organization of trade unions in this country. There's hardly a member of one of their trade unions who works for a wage anywhere close to the minimum wage. Despite all the rhetoric about helping the poor, they were in favor of a higher minimum wage for a very different reason, because it would protect the members of their unions from competition from the lower and lesser skilled people. When unions get higher wages for their members by restricting entry into an occupation, those higher wages are at the expense of other workers who find their opportunities reduced. When government pays its employees higher wages, Those higher wages are at the expense of the taxpayer. But when workers get higher wages and more civilized working conditions through the free market, when they get them by firms competing with one another for the best workers, by workers competing with one another for the best jobs, those higher wages are at nobody's expense. They can only come from higher productivity, greater capital investment, more widely diffused skills. The whole pie is bigger. There's more for the worker, but there's also more for the employer, the investor, the consumer, and even the taxpayer. That's the way a free market system distributes the fruits of economic progress among all the people. That's the essence of the age of the worker.